We're going to go ahead and put the intake on this motor. I'm going to give you a couple of pro tips on how to do this. First things first, always use studs in the four corners when you drop the intake down. That way you can drop the intake on square without any screwing around and go straight to bolt down. It'll all be lined up and you won't be moving it around, dislodging your RTV and dislodging your gaskets and so on. So that's the number one tip. Before I started this, I cleaned up all these surfaces, degreased everything, and I poured a little bit of oil over those lifter to pushrod interfaces just so it's as oily as possible when we go to start it. I've got my area set up here. I've got my Right Stuff RTV, which, by the way, if you're going to use RTV as the end rails, don't screw around, use Right Stuff. This is the stuff the OEMs use. Costs twice as much as Ultra Black, but there's a reason because it's the stuff. Have your tools handy. I got my torque wrench and so on right here, so that's all ready to go. Then it's time sensitive. Once you lay the RTV down, you need to get this manifold cinched down and torqued up in good order, in good time, or else you'll end up with a leak. So what I'm going to do when we go to put it on is I'm just going to turn the camera on, let it roll, do the install. We'll see how it turns out. I swear Edelbrock leaves this baffle loose just to screw guys up. But if you don't put this in, you're going to get yourself a major oil consumption problem. Goes right there over the EGR hole, and it installs with these little hammer-in studs. So you put those in there, hammer it in. Don't forget this. Otherwise you got to take the manifold off to do it again. You double check your torque specs. Remember, these are aluminum heads. So Edelbrock recommends 15 to 18 foot-pounds, not the 25 foot-pounds that Ford recommends, because those are iron heads. So don't screw around and use the Ford recommendation. About 18 is about right for your final step. I like to keep the torque sequence handy when I'm doing this, just so I have everything we're going to need handy. That way when we go ahead here, we're not running around going, I can't find something. These Felpro gaskets, the blue Printo seal side goes towards the manifold, the other side goes towards the head. Actually, before we actually grab them, we're going to take our Permatex high tack and we're going to paint a little bit of this stuff on, especially around the water passages. Now it's there to hold the gaskets in place when we do this, but it also helps with the seal around the water passages. So we put a little bit on there like that. We put a little bit on there like that. You don't want to lay this stuff on too thick. Just enough. Okay. And if we can avoid getting it up there, all the better. Whoa. And I like to put a couple dabs of it on here just to help with the adherence. Okay. It can go on either side. It's symmetrical. We'll slip it over our stud. I'm going to bring this down and we're going to get that lined up cleanly with our ports. You can just use your fingers in the edges of these ports. To ensure we're lined up. Okay, let's do the other side. You don't have to go around all the ports with this, and the more of it you use, the harder it is to ever clean this up again. So try not to go too nuts. But use enough so that the gasket will stick. And when we position the manifold, we're just going to look down those ports and double check that everything looks the way it should. The next step is the RTV. And we need little strokes in the four corners here and a big bead across the china wall. Use a caulking gun style RTV dispenser like this. And don't be shy. You want a big, glorious bead there. Then in the corners, lay down a generous dollop. Now we got that stuff laid down, the clock is ticking, so let's try not to dawdle. We'll cap up our expensive tube of RTV. We'll run and grab our manifold, which is set up just off camera here, ready to go. Now, this is a critical point here. You want to have good control. Get this over the four studs. I'm going to set it down gently in one smooth motion. Okay. Then we're going to look down the hole. It looks lined up and about the same on each side. And we can take a little look here and make sure that we don't have it cockeyed like this. All right. So the manifold's in place. There's a couple of special bolts you got to deal with on this. Most of these bolts are the same. But there's one here with a stud in particular that's used for the heater tube. We want to make sure we have that in the right place. Because we're reusing these stock manifold bolts. There's another one with a stud that's for the upper to lower intake brace, which we are not using. And it actually goes back in one of these stud locations. So let's get the studs out. Now we've got these other bolts all started. So they're out of the way. We can get a quick look at our squish here. Looks like it's going to squish all right. That studded bolt goes in there. And the bag isn't empty because there's a nut for the heater tube. Okay, so every bolt is just started. We'll use a quick tool like this to tighten them down. We're going to start out, we'll do this in order. That's this one is one. Now I think it's a good idea to always do these in the torque order, but this first just spins it down thing isn't that big a deal. We're heading for 18 foot-pounds. We're going to start out here. Probably don't need quite that much extension. We're going to start out here at 8. Another tip is, even if you use cheap tools, for the most part, when you do this kind of work, get a good torque wrench. And it's pretty hard to beat these snap-on wrenches. Once you use a torque wrench like this, it's hard to go back to some kind of a cheap wrench. And to be honest, the cheap ones are not trustworthy, and these are important. It's important that this work. I usually go in more steps than are strictly recommended, just because the more evenly you tighten this down, the better off you're going to be. Okay, we're at 12 foot-pounds. It's a good time to just come back here, get a look at your RTV, front and back, satisfy yourself that you're going to get a seal with that, which it looks like we are. I'm going to go 15. 15 is the bottom of the acceptable range according to Edelbrock. What you'll see is, as you go down here, these bolts you come back to have less torque on them, because as you tighten in one place, it cinches things down a little bit, compressing gaskets and whatnot, and seems looser in other places. Oh, I don't think it's good enough to just go 18. Which is what we're heading for here. You need to go around a couple times. Don't make the mistake of doing this with a extension that the socket doesn't sit on properly, or when you go to go across, suddenly you end up dropping the socket off into the motor, and that's not a happy moment. Okay, that's 15. So I'm going to snug this up to 17. By the way, these might be factory intake bolts, but I washed them ultrasonically, and then I brass wheeled them to get them in good condition for this. Okay, so that's 17. So that's well within our target range here. I think rather than set it to 18, I'm just going to go around again here, and we'll see how we're doing. So you see how that turns a little more? Even though I just finished it at 17. That's 17 again. So we're not going to increase the torque value here. We're just going to go over it a couple times. Until we stop getting any significant turn. You can see I get quite a bit of additional turning on this first retry. So that's 2 cracks at 17. Got to use your discretion here a little bit. But where are we at for time? 17 minutes. Usually shooting for 15 minutes, and by now we're out of danger on the RTV. We've got it all tight enough. That should all be good. But let's try a third go around on this. Still getting a little bit, but not that much. So it's 3 times around. You can go on and on and on. You probably never stop moving at all. Completely stop moving. But it's mostly stopped. 3 passes at 17 ought to be good enough. And it looks like we've got a seal on the China wall. That should be good. Now I like to leave this a day anyway before getting too much further. Another little secret is sometimes this China wall RTV will cure up in a way that makes it hard to get the distributor in. So just while it's still soft, lay it back there. That way, when you go to put the distributor in, you're not going to have a nightmare. Well, it's not that big of a nightmare, but you got to cut it. And sometimes while you're cutting it, you drop the frickin' piece in the motor. So take my advice. Give it a quick brush back while it's still soft, and you don't have that trouble. Then we're going to put our plug back in there. And we've kind of reached end of the day. We're going to let that set up overnight. Leave the temperature up in the shop while it sets up, and we should be good. I didn't mention it, but one other thing that's a good tip is keep your gaskets and your parts together so they're the same temperature when you go to assemble them. You can run into trouble where you have a manifold sitting in like a cold garage and a gasket sitting in a warm house, and then you go to do this assembly and you take the gasket out, and the gasket and the manifold are different temperatures, and when you bolt them together they don't seal up quite right. It sounds crazy, but it can happen. So it's real easy to keep your parts and your gaskets together. And then, like when I'm going to do a job like this with RTV, it's got to be warm enough. Normally keep the shop a little on the cool side. That's why I wear a jacket in here, partly anyway. Spend the money, heat the place up a little bit. And like I knew this was going to happen today, so I turned the temperature up last night. So there's been 24 hours of everything with a nice stable temperature that's in the range that allows us to install these parts. So those are good tips. Temperature control is easy to handle. It's something that guys forget about, and it can cause trouble if you don't look after it. All right, I'd say we got an assembled motor here, basically. Looks good. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell so that you won't miss out on future videos.